It's birthday time again, movie fans. This week we're spotlighting the one and only Claire Danes on her big day. Probably known by most for the show Homeland, she's got quite the film career too. Always low-key, never over the top, and for an obvious leading lady, she never chooses movies where she's the lone standout. Danes is usually part of a big, talented cast, and that tells me she's choosing parts, not just steps in a career. But first, she plays the ultimate leading lady in Romeo and Juliet. This, at the time, modern telling of Shakespeare's tragedies, the most familiar a lot of people are with some of the world's greatest writing. And while that itself is tragic, I'm grateful. You know the story, and that's the point. Even with the play, it was never a new plot. What makes it so great is the language, Shakespeare's descriptions and comparisons. So when evaluating any production of his work, you need to look at how the action matches the word. And this movie makes a pretty iconic go at it. Foreshadowing, Father Lawrence has my favorite line when he says, "These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die like fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. The sweetest honey is loathsome in its own deliciousness, therefore love moderately." Next, Danes joins Giovanni Ribisi and Omar Epps in The Mod Squad. Based on a TV show from the late 60s, this movie sort of flew under the radar. The trio play reformed criminals who are recruited to be undercover cops, but when their boss is murdered, they're on their own. It's weird because this falls between genres, between decades, the music's all over the place, but because of that, there's nothing else like it. Also, there are some really cool cars in this movie. Epps drives a gold Nova towards the end that's perfection. And Epps says it all when they're talking about difficulties on the job. He says, "Beats jail." And finally, Claire Danes is a parole officer partnering up with Richard Gere in The Flock. She plays his replacement who quickly learns his interests in the job cross the professional line. The focus is on sexual offenders, so this takes us to some dark corners, definitely just for adults. And yes, randomly, that's Avril Lavigne. An examination of the criminal rehabilitation system, this movie's all about monsters and how they're made. Danes and Gere both quote Nietzsche, saying, "If you look long enough into the abyss will look long into you." And here's where you can stream this week's choices. Romeo and Juliet is on Hulu. You can find The Mod Squad on Max, and The Flock is streaming on Prime Video, Peacock, and it's free with ads on Plex. That's this week's watch list. Happy birthday, Claire Danes. For more of my movie recommendations, hit up our spot on WCBI.com. I'll be back next week with 3 more. Until then, as always, leave the criticism, take the cannoli.